They called my chest empty. That was the sentence my son, Daniel Rowan, spat out across the crowded dining room table. His voice sharp enough to cut through every breath. He said it loudly, not in the quiet shame of a whisper, but in front of Karen, his wife, and 3 of their friends who had dropped by after church. His eyes flicked toward the old cedar chest by the window, the one that had followed me through 50 years of marriage. Across every season of sacrifice, every hard-earned dollar spent keeping a roof over our heads. He looked at it like it was nothing but dead wood, a useless box. They laughed. Karen leaned in, her nails tapping on her wine glass, and said, empty, like the woman who keeps guarding it. My name is Selma Rowan. I am 79 years old, a widow, and for 4 decades I ran a laundromat in our Ohio town. I folded thousands of shirts and pressed thousands of uniforms, believing sweat and soap could hold a family together. My hands grew raw, my back bent, and my dreams shrank down to the hope that my children would live better than I did. Now, after all of that, I sat at the head of a table in my own home, being laughed at by my own blood. Daniel, my eldest at 52, has always been the kind who wants to shine brighter than everyone else. He dresses sharp, talks sharp, and thinks sharp is the same as being good. He built his career in finance, walking around like he invented ambition, forgetting that his first loan came from the calloused hands of his father. He leaned back that day, legs spread wide, taking up space as if this house was his throne room. Karen, his wife, is 49 and carries herself like she married into a kingdom too small for her appetite. She has that smile women wear when they want to make you feel like a burden, a smile wrapped in pity but dripping with disdain. She has told me countless times that downsizing would do me good, that an old woman shouldn't rattle around alone in a big house. That day, she smirked when Daniel mocked my chest, as if stripping me of dignity was just another family game. I said nothing at first. Silence can be a sword sharper than words, but my hands clenched under the table. That cedar chest had been my one constant, carried from the first apartment I shared with my late husband Thomas, to this home where we raised our children. It held more than papers and fabric. It held the proof of my life, the memory of every sacrifice made invisible. By time, they did not see it. They refused to. Daniel raised his glass. We should clear it out, he announced, his tone casual but his eyes already calculating. No one needs that old junk. We could put something useful there. Maybe a wine cabinet. His friends chuckled. Karen brushed her hand along his arm, encouraging his cruelty, as if to say, yes, keep going, break her down more. I forced myself to breathe. The room smelled of roasted chicken and cheap perfume, but all I could taste was bitterness. My gaze moved to the chest, its wood darkened with age, edges worn smooth by decades of hands. My husband had built its secret compartments himself, though no one else knew that but me. Daniel thought it was empty. Karen thought it was rubbish. And in that moment, I realized they had no idea what it truly was. I stood slowly, my knees stiff from years of labor, and walked to the chest. Every eye followed me, expecting me to crumble, to yield, to admit my life amounted to nothing. I opened the lid. Dust motes swirled in the air. Inside lay stacks of old envelopes, faded linens, brittle receipts, things Daniel dismissed with a laugh, but buried among them was a single yellowed envelope, one I had kept untouched for decades. My husband's handwriting stretched across the front, steady and bold. The room grew quiet, curious. Daniel smirked. See, trash. You can't live your life in scraps of paper. He reached forward as if to snatch it, but I pressed my hand over the envelope and held it close. His eyes narrowed. He thought he saw desperation. He thought he saw a mother clinging to dust. What he did not see was a woman gathering strength. I tucked the envelope against my chest. It felt warm, alive. My voice came out steady. This chest is not empty. And neither am I. Karen rolled her eyes. For heaven's sake, Selma, don't make a scene. We all know you like to hoard memories, but memories don't pay bills. Her words slid across the table like oil, smooth and poisonous. Her friends nodded, their polite smiles masking their hunger for gossip. I looked at Daniel then, my son, my blood, the boy whose knees I once bandaged when he fell from his bike, whose first suit I paid for by working double shifts. And now he stared at me as though I were an obstacle to be removed. His gaze was colder than any stranger's. It was then I realized the betrayal wasn't in the laughter or the insult. It was in the way he looked at me, like I was already gone, erased, a ghost haunting a house he believed belonged to him. I sat back down, the envelope still in my hand. The room moved on, conversations shifting to stocks, vacations, new furniture. They pretended I wasn't there. Daniel never once looked at me again that evening. Karen made sure to refill everyone's glasses, but left mine empty. My house, my table, and yet I was invisible. When the guests left, Daniel lingered. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, not in comfort but in warning. Mom, you need to stop clinging to the past. That chest, it's just wood and paper. When the time comes, Karen and I will take care of everything. Don't make this harder than it has to be. He spoke as if my life were already over, as if I were merely waiting for permission to disappear. His hand pressed down, and for a moment, I imagined what it would feel like to slap it away. Instead, I nodded, letting him think he had won, but inside, something old and buried stirred awake. After he left, I locked the door and sat beside the chest. I opened the envelope under the dim lamp. Inside was a single page, brittle and fragile, written in my husband's hand. The words were simple. If you are reading this, Selma, it means the time has come to protect what we've built. Trust no one until you find the bottom. I traced his handwriting with trembling fingers. The chest was not empty, neither was I, and though Daniel thought he had stripped me of dignity, he had only lit the match. That night, I placed the letter back, closed the chest, and sat in silence. The house creaked around me. Outside, autumn leaves scraped against the windows. My heart pounded not with fear, but with a fierce, quiet certainty. The betrayal I felt at that table was not an ending, it was a beginning. By 9 in the morning, I was standing at the county recorder's counter, watching a clerk scroll through deeds as if a fingertip could wipe a lifetime clean. The screen showed this parcel, this roof, these rooms. Then it showed something else, my name pulled out like a loose thread from an old sweater, leaving a gap where I had lived for decades. The clerk confirmed the file was updated last year, her tone careful, the way people speak around a lit match. She printed a copy and slid it across, pages warm from the machine, the ink still breathing. On the second page, the house stood, in black letters under a trust controlled by my son, Daniel Rowan, 52, my firstborn, who learned early to take more space than he was given. Next to his name, a neat legal line noted the instrument that altered everything. On the last page, I found a consent letter with a signature I knew, as well as my own handwriting. It belonged to my daughter, Evelyn Rowan, 55, my girl who moved away, who always apologized for missing holidays and promised to make it up next time. I held the paper steady until the letters stopped swimming. The clerk asked if I wanted certified copies. I told her I wanted 3. She clipped them, stamped the seal, and kept her eyes on her keyboard. She didn't ask questions. People in small towns rarely do. They read headlines on your face and pretend not to. Outside, the wind cut across the government building's steps, and I stood with 3 envelopes against my coat, hearing traffic move past me like a river that didn't know my name. I remembered the night Daniel announced that my chest was empty, and felt how convenient that word can be for people who want to unload their guilt onto the old. It is easier to pretend the mother is hollow than to face the truth that you hollowed her out. I didn't go home. I turned toward the red brick church at the corner of Maple and 3rd. The bell tower threw a long shadow across the parking lot, and the glass doors gave back a thinner version of Miss 59, a widow who kept a laundromat open through blizzards and recessions. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of lemon oil and candle wax, the scent of places where people try to polish their sorrow into something presentable. I found Reverend Cole in his office, a 60-year-old pastor who has spent half his life in this town and all of that time walking the line between comfort and truth. He looked up and recognized me not as a parishioner but as Selma, the woman Thomas asked him to check on if the children turned cold. I did not ask for a prayer. I set the envelope on his desk and told him what the county computer had shown. He read quietly, the way men read verdicts. He asked if there had been a family meeting about the change, the kind where people use cheerful words to do hard things. I told him there had been wine and laughter, a table, a chest called empty, and no meeting. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a small notebook. Names, dates, funerals, baptisms, this town's true registry. He thumbed to an entry and traced my husband's handwriting in an old note Thomas had left with him years back. He said Thomas once worried that if anything happened to him, I might be pushed to the edges of the very life I built. He had left a request with the pastor, not a legal document, not something a court would weigh, but a moral ledger. If I was ever cornered, Cole was to stand with me long enough for me to stand by myself. He asked what I needed. For a moment, I considered saying I needed my son back, the one who came home from school with scuffed knees and science projects that never quite work, but once are not facts. I said I needed witnesses. He nodded. He would not demand that I forgive in exchange for help, and he would not sugar the wrong done to me. He offered to make copies and keep one set in the church safe. He told me he would document the day I discovered the change and the hour he saw the papers. That was the measure he could give. Not miracles, not a reversal of ink already laid down, but a record that somebody saw what was done, in that office, under a cross, and a faded wall map of the county. I learned what a conscience looks like in daylight. It is an old pastor counting out the tools at handpens, forms, dates, and placing them in front of a woman who refuses to vanish. He walked me to the sanctuary and sat in the last pew. He said Thomas once told him the house was as much my bones as my shelter. He said he had not wanted to interfere out of respect for family boundaries. He added, with that painful honesty only a decent man offers, that silence can disguise itself as respect and become something else entirely. He reminded me that I was allowed to protect what I had built. When I left, he pressed a simple index, pared into my palm, a line written there in his square hand. Write down what happened, even if nobody wants to read it. I took the long way home and thought about Evelyn's signature. My daughter, the baby, who clung to my apron strings while I sorted whites and colors, who fell asleep on folded towels still warm from the dryer. She grew up soft-spoken, then, hardened by distance. Work took her out of state. Life trimmed our calls down to birthdays and quick check-ins. When I saw her name consenting to the arrangement that pushed me off my own deed, I felt a clean, cold pain, like ice water poured down the center of my back. It was not rage. Rage is loud. This was something steadier, the feeling you get when a doctor tells you the truth in a tone that will not break. At home, light pooled across the living room floor, and the cedar chest sat in its usual square of sun. Dust filmed the lid. I set the envelopes beside it and fetched the small tin of laundry chalk I kept from the laundromat out of habit. A bit of blue that once marked stains and seams. I wrote my name across the chest's lid in a firm line, Selma, then beneath it, in smaller letters, still here. The chalk left a bright trail. The words looked like stitches. If anyone tried to move the chest, they would see them first. I opened the lid and took out the yellowed envelope I had guarded the night before. My husband's hand felt alive on the paper. I returned it gently, then lifted the stacks of linen, the brittle receipts, the small piles of photographs bound with string. I did not sort them. I only made space in the center of the chest, and set the 3 stamped copies from the county there, face up, so anyone nosy enough to rummage would be confronted with the truth they had tried to hide in filings and formalities. It was my small act of order against their chaos, a quiet declaration that I would not live merely as a rumor in my own house. I boiled tea and sat by the window. Across the street, a boy pedaled fast down the hill, jacket flapping like a small flag. I wondered if his mother would one day sit in a county office and watch her name fall off a screen. I hoped not. We raise children to be strong, then we forget to teach them the difference between strong and cruel. In the afternoon, I drove to the parish hall. Wednesday lunches bring out people who can't afford to be invisible, widows, veterans, men who've run out of reasons to pretend they are all right. I didn't go for food, I went for the bulletin board. Tucked among flyers for blood drives and pancake breakfasts, I pinned a single index card of my own. I wrote nothing but a date, the property parcel number, and the phrase name removed, without consent. I didn't sign it. Small towns keep their own detective work. People would read it, measure it against what they knew of my family, and they would talk. I don't count on gossip for justice, but sometimes sunlight lands where it needs to. When I returned, the driveway held a car that did not belong to me. Daniel had come while I was out. The front door was locked, but a brass key lay under the dome. At the spare I once gave him for emergencies. He had used it and put it back, the gesture neat, like resetting a chess piece. Inside, the air held a faint scent of his cologne, and something else, citrus polish. A wastebasket in the hall contained the contents of a drawer I had kept by the phone address books. rubber bands, the pencil sharpener that resembled a tiny shoe. He had reorganized my kitchen shelves, aligning jars as if tidiness could justify trespass. On the dining table, a folder rested open with blank forms clipped inside. Their headings told me everything: inventory, property, contents, transfer of personal effects. He had begun dividing my life into categories. I noted it all and did not touch the forms. I photographed the folder with the index card Reverend Cole gave me propped beside it, then put the card back in my pocket. I walked to the living room and found the chest undisturbed, my chalk words unbroken. The envelope still lay inside. I closed the lid carefully and turned the key in the lock on its hasp-an old lock Thomas had installed years ago when the children were small and curious. The click sounded louder than I expected. Late in the day, I called Evelyn. Not to argue, I didn't have the energy for circles, but to name what was already true. She sent me to voicemail, as I half expected. I left a brief message, reporting the discovery at the county office and the copies now secured. I said nothing about betrayal. I said only that I wanted to hear her say, in her own words, why my name had to disappear for her life to function. Then I set the phone down and did not wait by it like a girl waiting for a dance invitation. Waiting is another way of giving away hours you'll never get back. Around 5, I returned to the church to deliver an extra set of documents to Reverend Cole. As we had agreed, he was in the fellowship hall, folding chairs with the methodical care of someone who understands that rituals keep people from falling apart. He introduced me to nobody. He knows the cost of turning sorrow into spectacle. He placed my envelope in a metal lockbox and logged it in a ledger he keeps for moments like these. Then he asked me to walk with him to the sanctuary. We sat in silence, and after a time he said he once kept quiet with families because he believed love would self-correct if given space. He added that he had learned the hard way that some harms grow in the shade. He told me he could bring a notary to the house the following day to certify that the copies were true when he saw them and that I possessed them. These are small tools, he admitted, but they are tools, and I could use them. That was the closest thing to absolution I needed, not for my anger, which had its reasons, but for the decision to stop being polite about my own erasure. I thanked him and said I would be ready. Before I left, he retrieved a folded note from his desk, a line Thomas had written on a day long before the children's hearts turned into ledgers. My husband had asked him to tell me, if necessary, that I was free to choose distance if closeness became a weapon. Freedom can look like a locked door when the right people are outside it. Dusk bled across the street when I parked. The house glowed with that warm, late light that makes old wood look like honey. Inside, I set the kettle and took the chess key from my pocket, running my thumb along its grooves. The phone buzzed once and stopped. A text from Evelyn arrived, a long paragraph broken into short, careful sentences. She said she had only agreed to Daniel's plan because he had promised it was temporary, a tool to manage things while I transitioned. She mentioned paperwork, tax advantages, simplification. She wrote that she loved me, that she was trying to avoid conflict, that I had to trust them. She ended with a line about families staying together when they face facts. I read it twice and set the phone face down. Love that cannot survive plain truth is a costume. I made tea and placed the steaming mug on a coaster my husband carved out of a maple scrap. Then I took a thick black marker from the kitchen drawer and wrote 3 words on the outside of each envelope in my neatest script: do not destroy. I slid one beneath the mattress, tucked one behind a row of books on the shelf, and returned the third to the chest, laying it on top. I stood back and looked at the chalk letters on the lid, my name, and the promise beneath it. The chest did not look like furniture. It looked like a witness. Later, when the house settled into evening noises, I gathered the loose family photographs from the bottom of a hallway drawer. I did not search for meaning in smiles captured on glossy paper. I simply stacked them by year, arranged them on the dining table, and left one empty frame in the center, its glass cleaned, its back open. As I moved through the rooms turning off lamps, I considered the kind of emptiness that is chosen, a space cleared not for someone else to fill but for something honest to lend. That frame would hold whatever came next, not because I craved nostalgia, but because I refused to let anyone else write me out. Before bed, I returned to the chest one final time. I placed my hand flat on the lid and pressed down until the wood warmed my palm. I thought of the laundromat, the clatter of coins, the steady churn, the way shirts come clean if given enough water and heat and time. People are not so simple. but some stains announce themselves and dare you to live with them. I am old enough to choose what I will live with. I will live with the truth that my children did something they should be ashamed of. I will live with my name written where it belongs. I will live with the knowledge that a woman who has folded other people's clothes for 40 years can still unfold a lie and lay it out in the sun. When I turned out the last light, the chalk lines on the chest caught a sliver of moon and shone like stitches again. If Daniel came tomorrow with a fresh plan and a wider smile, he would find more than paper and wood. He would find me, and he would find a house that remembers who built it. I slept with the index card from the pastor under my pillow, not for comfort, but as a reminder that the story had been written down by more than one hand. In the dark, the house breathed around me. Somewhere, a floorboard answered the night with a small complaint. I answered it quietly in my mind and counted the hours I had left to prepare. I do not race anymore. I measure. I do not plead. I document. They called my chest empty. Tomorrow, I would begin showing exactly how wrong that was. The next morning, I pulled the photo boxes from the hallway closet. The ones that had followed me through moves, storms, and decades of birthdays. I spread them across the dining table, sunlight falling over the neat stacks like a spotlight on evidence. My children used to flip through these albums, laughing at crooked haircuts and Halloween costumes. I believed photographs told the truth, that they preserved a life so it could never be erased. I was wrong. When I opened the first album, the ache hit me harder than any insult. Pages had been sliced clean, photographs cut down, leaving ragged corners where my face should have been. My husband still stood in frame, Daniel as a boy on his shoulders, Evelyn at his side with missing teeth and ribboned hair. But me, I was gone, carved out of my own history. At first I thought time had simply worn the images thin. Then I saw the sharp edges, the deliberate scissors mark. Someone had removed me with care, the kind of cold attention that takes time. I turned another page, vacation by Lake Erie, Thomas steering the rented boat, Daniel holding a fishing pole too big for his hands, Evelyn laughing into the wind. I had been the one taking the picture, except I remembered handing the camera over to Thomas so I could join in. Yet here, in this album, there was no trace of me. The background stretched wide and blank, but my body, my smile, my proof of existence was gone. By the third album, my hands trembled. On the back of one photo, in Daniel's handwriting, was a line scrawled like a verdict. No one needs to remember the woman who clings to the past. The ink was recent, not the fading script of decades ago. It was my son's adult hand, steady and cruel. I sat down hard in the chair. The absence pressed heavier than any weight. Erasure is not silence, it is noise made permanent. Each missing face, each empty space shouted the same thing. I was expendable. The woman who worked herself ragged to keep children clothed and fed could be sliced out as easily as trimming a loose thread. Karen's neat hand had touched the albums too. I could see her style in the reorganization, the plastic sleeves wiped clean, the new labels affixed in tidy print. She had aided him, helping turn my family's record into a curated exhibit where I did not belong, and Evelyn's silence thundered louder. She must have known, or at least seen. You cannot cut a mother from a book without children noticing. Closed the albums one by one, stacking them like coffins. Then, I carried them back to the cedar chest. I opened the lid and set them inside, covers facing upward. A row of accusations locked in wood. The envelope from Thomas lay still in its place, a single page promising something yet unseen. Around it, my vanished life filled the chest in negative space. Empty, they had called it. Yet it held absence so thick it could suffocate by noon. I drove to Evelyn's house, 2 towns away. The road wound past bare fields and shuttered barns. I replayed the message I had left her, the one she had not returned. When I pulled into her driveway, her car sat out front, its metallic shine catching sun. She opened the door at my knock, her eyes widening, then narrowing with hesitation. She hugged me politely, as though embracing a neighbor instead of a mother. We sat in her kitchen, the counters gleamed with granite, her fridge covered in magnets from vacations she never invited me on. I placed one of the altered photographs on the table between us. She froze. The cut edge glared up, exposing what was missing. Daniel keeps the albums, she said, voice small. He must have done that. I didn't know, but I recognized the evasion. She had known. Her name on the deed, her silence in every phone call, her clipped text messages. This was not ignorance. This was complicity. You signed, I said simply. I didn't raise my voice. Rage would have let her off easy. Calm words are harder to escape. You signed my name away, and then watched him cut me out of my life. She reached for the photo, then stopped. It was supposed to be temporary, just until things were settled. Daniel said. I cut her off. Daniel said. Always, Daniel said. What did you say, Evelyn? Her eyes watered but no tears fell. She had practiced restraint, learned to survive by agreeing, but I was not asking her to survive me. I was asking her to face what she had done. She whispered finally. I said yes. That was all. 2 words that sliced deeper than any scissor. I stood. The photograph remained on the counter, a piece of truth she couldn't sweep away. As I walked to the door, she followed, pleading soft. Excuses about mortgages, financial pressure, promises made. I didn't turn back. Explanations are not stitches. They don't repair what's cut. At home, dusk settled across the house. I lit one lamp, leaving shadows to fill the corners. I opened the chest again and placed the photograph on top of the albums. Then I pulled out the yellowed envelope once more. Thomas's script stared at me. If you are reading this, Selma, it means the time has come to protect what we've built. Trust no one until you find the bottom. The chest was not only wood, it was witness. It knew the shape of everything removed, everything denied. My husband's words, my children's betrayal, my own silence. It carried all of it. I sat beside it and whispered aloud, not to the walls or the absent children, but to myself. I will not be erased. That night I did not sleep. I laid the county papers on my nightstand, Evelyn's absence heavier than Daniel's cruelty. Betrayal comes sharp from a son, but from a daughter it bleeds longer. I thought of the laundromat years, the 2 of them, perched on folding tables eating sandwiches while I pressed uniforms. I thought of nights I stayed late, pushing quarters into the machines to keep lights on, only to be thanked now with blank spaces in albums. Toward morning, I rose, boiled water, and brewed tea. The steam rose like smoke, like warning. The chest sat still in its corner, lid shut, holding all I had left. They believed it empty. They believed I was empty. They were wrong. Tomorrow, I would open another layer, and I would not do it quietly. It was Harold who carried the memory I needed, though he didn't know it until I knocked on his door. Harold was 81, an old friend of my husband's, bound to Thomas by a war that had ended before our children were born. I had not seen him in years, yet when he opened the door, I saw in his lined face the echo of every photograph Daniel had tried to cut me out of. Harold had the kind of presence that smelled faintly of tobacco and time, the kind of man who knew secrets because life had forced him to keep them. We sat in his living room, a space crammed with maps and medals, shelves sagging with history books. He poured coffee, black and bitter, and leaned back in his chair with the kind of patience earned only by survivors. When I told him about the house deed, about Evelyn's signature, and Daniel's cold laughter, his eyes narrowed, but he did not interrupt. I placed the county papers on the table between us, the evidence stamped and sealed, and then I pulled out one of the mutilated photographs. He stared at the cut edges, his mouth tightening, and finally said, "Thomas warned me this could happen." The words knocked the air out of me. Harold explained slowly, carefully, as though each memory might shatter. Years ago, Thomas had confided in him that he worried his children would one day measure love in money, and that I would be left with nothing but promises. Harold told me my husband had put aside a protection, not cash in an account, but a set of investments tied to an old manufacturing company where he once worked after the war. The paperwork was lodged in a safe deposit box at the local bank. Thomas had entrusted Harold with knowledge of its existence, not the key, only the assurance that if I were ever threatened, I should know to ask. I felt my hands tremble around the coffee cup. My husband had foreseen the betrayal, prepared for it, and yet never told me directly. Perhaps he thought love would protect me longer than paper. Perhaps he did not want me to live with suspicion. But here was Harold, holding the memory like a torch in the dark. The next day I went to the bank. The clerk led me to a private booth and carried out the box registered under Thomas Rowan's name. My pulse raced as I reached for it. I half expected to find bonds, papers, maybe the kind of financial safety net that could not be erased with a forged signature. But when the lid opened, the box was nearly bare. A few faded envelopes lay inside, brittle from age, and at the very bottom, a slip of paper from the bank itself, Contents transferred. Per authorization. Dated 10 years ago. Authorization. I scanned the form stapled inside. There was a signature. Not Thomas's. The curve was familiar. The arrogance of it seared into my memory. It was Daniel's. My son had discovered the deposit, imitated his father's hand, and drained the safeguard meant for me. The evidence lay right there in the ink, a theft disguised as family business. I asked the clerk for a copy. She hesitated, but I leaned forward and fixed her with the kind of stare that only a woman who has lost nearly everything can give. She made the copy. I slipped it into my purse with shaking fingers. Back home, I sat in front of the cedar chest. I opened the lid, pulled the albums and letters aside, and placed the bank copy inside. My chest held absence, mutilated photographs, and now, proof of theft. They had called it empty, but it was growing heavier with each day, its belly filling with betrayal. That evening, Harold called. He said he had thought more about what Thomas told him. There had been another layer, a deeper secret. Thomas had once hinted at an old favor, something owed from wartime, an obligation that might surface if everything else was stripped away. Harold did not know what form it took: land, papers, perhaps just a man's word, but he remembered Thomas speaking of it with the weight of someone who expected it to matter. The phone shook in my hand. I thanked Harold and promised to see him again soon. When I hung up, I realized Daniel had not just stolen from me, he had robbed his father's memory, rewriting a man's final duty into his own possession. The night grew long. The house seemed to listen as I moved, its boards creaking under my steps. I pulled the old key from the chest's hasp and locked it tight. Daniel could force open a door, rewrite a deed, cut photographs, forge signatures, but he could not reach into wood that had been carved by Thomas's hands, built for endurance, made to guard. I sat in the dark living room, the chest's outline sharp in the moonlight. I thought of the word empty again. Empty means nothing left. But my chest now carried proof of everything. My husband's warning, my son's theft, my daughter's complicity, the weight of years pressed into paper. Empty was a lie. The truth was heavier than gold. The following Sunday, I went back to church. Reverend Cole stood at the pulpit, speaking of forgiveness, but his eyes found me and faltered. After the service, he approached, hesitant. I told him about the bank, about Daniel's forged hand. He shook his head slowly and admitted he had known Thomas wanted to shield me, but never imagined the children would sink so far. He promised to write down my account, to file a notarized statement of what I had found. It would not undo the theft, but it would place my truth in permanent record. As I left, I passed Daniel in the parking lot. He was helping Karen into the car, his hand resting casually on her back. He saw me, smirked, and tilted his head toward the chestnut tree where church families gathered. "Mom, you should really stop clinging to old boxers. People talk. It's embarrassing." Karen giggled. Her laughter carried sharp across the lot. Families turned to look, then turned away quickly, unwilling to witness his son belittling his mother. My face burned, not from shame but from clarity. Daniel was no longer hiding his contempt behind paperwork. He was dragging it into the open, daring me to break. I walked past him without a word, my purse heavy with the stolen authorization slip, my chest at home waiting with its growing archive. Let him laugh, let him boast. The weight he thought he had stolen was still mine to wield. That night I opened the cedar chest one more time. I laid my hand flat on the lid, feeling the grain under my palm, and whispered, "Thomas, you were right. The time has come." The chest answered with silence, but in that silence I heard resolve, not just mine, but his, Harold's. Cole's, the faint chorus of those who still believed in truth heavier than lies. I locked it again, slid the key under my pillow, and waited for morning. My children thought they had emptied me. They had only prepared me. The letter came folded into a plain white envelope, slid under my front door on a Thursday morning when frost clung to the windows and the yard wore silence like a shroud. No return address, only my name written in a hand too familiar. I knew before opening it that it would not be kindness. Evelyn's handwriting always carried a certain hesitation, letters leaning toward apology, curves that looked like they wanted to step backward. I opened it at the dining table. The words were short and neat, but they struck harder than any storm. She had written to Daniel, "Do what you need. I will not stand in the way. Just make sure the family's name is protected." Beneath it, in smaller script, she had added, "Send my part when it's done." My daughter, my Evelyn, who once tucked daisies into my apron pocket while I worked at the laundromat, had traded me for a share of profit. Her loyalty had been signed away in ink as sharp as any blade. I held the paper, and it felt heavier than steel. Betrayal from Daniel I had braced for, but from Evelyn, the wound was deeper. A son can turn greedy. A daughter is supposed to hold memory. That afternoon, I drove to her house again, letter in hand. She opened the door with surprise, shading into unease, as though she had not expected her words to travel back so quickly. I stepped inside without waiting for her welcome. The kitchen smelled of lemon polish, the counters gleaming as if cleanliness could scrub guilt. I placed the letter on the table between us. She froze, staring at her own handwriting. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Double quotes. "Where do you think?" I answered. "Secrets leave trails. This one led straight back to you." Her hands shook as she tried to fold the letter closed, but I pressed it flat with my palm. "You told him to cut me out," I said. "Not just from the house, from the family." Evelyn's face twisted, torn between shame and defiance. "It wasn't like that. Daniel said you were making things impossible. He promised it was only temporary, just to keep things orderly." "Orderly," I cut in, the word bitter in my mouth. "Orderly is what you call it when you erase your own mother for convenience." She blinked, tears hovering but refusing to fall. "I needed help. I had debts. Things you don't understand. Daniel said if I agreed, he'd cover them." You thought selling me would buy you peace," I said. My voice stayed calm, though my chest felt like it might split. "And when he cut me out of photographs, when he forged your father's name at the bank, when he stood in church and called me empty, you still thought silence was safer." She slumped into a chair, the fight draining out of her. "I was scared," she whispered. Scared is a child's excuse. She was 55 years old, with a career, a house, a voice she refused to use. She had chosen comfort over conscience. I took the letter, folded it back into its envelope, and slipped it into my purse. "Fear doesn't erase what you've done," I said. "It only confirms it." I left her kitchen without another word. The air outside bit at my skin, sharp and clean, more honest than anything spoken inside that house. Back home, I returned to the cedar chest. I unlocked the hasp, lifted the lid, and placed Evelyn's letter with the rest of the evidence: the mutilated photographs, the forged authorization slip, the county deeds. The chest was no longer a vessel of memories. It was becoming an archive of crimes, each piece of paper weighed like stone, stacking proof upon proof that my children had not only abandoned me but conspired against me. That night, Daniel arrived unannounced. His knock was heavy, impatient. I opened the door and found him standing with Karen, her lipstick sharp, her eyes glittering with satisfaction. Daniel carried a folder under his arm. He brushed past me, without waiting to be invited, Karen trailing behind like a shadow with claws. "We need to talk," Daniel said, setting the folder on my dining table. He opened it and spread out documents, their crisp edges slicing the surface. "These are the plans. We're moving forward with the sale. You'll have a small allowance every month. It's for your own good." Karen chimed in, her voice syrupy. "You'll be more comfortable in a smaller place. Think of it as freedom. No more upkeep, no more stress." I looked at the papers. Contracts, valuations, transfer forms, lines, already prepared for signatures, mine absent but assumed. "You mean no more control?" I said softly. Daniel leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "You don't get it, Mom. You're not in charge anymore. We are. It's time you faced that. Blood is not automatic. Blood is what you earn. And right now, you're nothing but a tenant." Karen's smile widened. "An old tenant, living rent. It's generous, really." For a moment, silence roared, louder than their words. Then I straightened, my hand resting on the chest beside me. "You may think you've written me out," I said, "but this house still remembers who built it." "And so do I," Daniel scoffed, gathering the papers. "You'll sign, eventually. One way or another." He left them on the table, as if their presence would wear me down. Then he and Karen left, their laughter trailing out into the night. When the door closed, I locked it twice. I gathered the papers and added them to the chest. Each betrayal joined the others, stacking layer upon layer, until the lid seemed to strain against the weight. They called it empty, but it was overflowing with their contempt, their greed, their willingness to strip me bare. I sat in the lamplight, the chest before me, and opened Thomas's old letter again. His words stared up at me. If you are reading this, Selma, it means the time has come to protect what we built. Trust no one until you find the bottom. The bottom. I had not reached it yet, though my children seemed determined to dig me into it. But I would, and when I did, they would see that emptiness is not what defines me. That night, I slept lightly, the chest key under my pillow. In dreams, I saw Evelyn's face, bending over a table, her pen scratching my name away, while Daniel stood behind her, guiding her hand. And in the background, Karen watched, smiling. I woke with dawn sharp against the curtains, the taste of betrayal still on my tongue. The chest stood waiting. Soon, I would go deeper. Soon, I would find the bottom Thomas had spoken of, and when I did, the weight inside would not only protect me, it would crush the lies my children built. On Monday morning, I stepped onto my front lawn and found a sign jammed into the grass, its arrow pointing at my door. The letters were red and unapologetic. Open house. A sedan idled at the curb while two strangers stepped out, their faces wearing the polite curiosity of bargain hunters. Through the window I saw a woman in heels floating from room to room, measuring walls with her eyes and running a fingertip along the banister as if dust were an argument against my life. Daniel's handwriting was on the taped notice by the door, the kind of crisp block letters he uses when he wants to sound official. He had scheduled a viewing of my home while I still slept under its roof. I stood in the entryway and let the woman introduce herself as a real estate agent representing my son. She spoke in the tone people reserve for the very young or the very old, assuring me this visit would be quick and that they were just evaluating layout. When she stepped toward the living room, her gaze slid to the cedar chest, and she half smiled the way people do at an antique they plan to list as charming but dated. The two strangers asked if it opened. The agent said the owner had mentioned it was empty. She said it as if emptiness were a virtue. I placed my hand on the lid and told them the chest was not part of the showing. They blinked at my insistence, then at my name spelled in chalk across the wood, then drifted to the dining room, where my family photographs, what remained of them, had been rehung by Karen, with new spacing that left certain gaps looking intentional. I did not offer coffee. I kept my posture straight and counted the minutes. When they left, the agent snapped a picture of my porch without asking, adding the image to a carousel where I did not exist. I pulled the sign from the lawn and carried it inside. The metal post left a wound in the dirt. I set the sign face down on the kitchen tiles. A red mouth pressed shut. At noon, Reverend Cole drove up with a notary from the church. He had called ahead to say he was bringing someone who could witness documents. He said he believed in paper that tells the truth even when people won't. They sat at my dining table while I laid out the copies of the deed, the bank slip with the forged authorization, and the letter in Evelyn's hand. The notary worked methodically, stamping and recording, asking me to swear each page was what I said it was. Cole kept his eyes on the work, not on my face. There is a mercy in watching the task and not the pain. When they finished, the pastor said he wanted me to meet someone who handled cases like this, someone who knew how to drag the facts into a room where they couldn't be ignored. He made a call and asked if I had an hour. I said I had more than that. He smiled in the way men do when they decide another person has already won something difficult. At 1:30, a gray hatchback pulled into my driveway. A tall man stepped out carrying a slim briefcase and a legal pad. He was 35, with steady eyes and a posture that read endurance more than power. He introduced himself as Michael, an attorney who split his time between a small private practice and volunteering at a clinic that helps older adults untangle the damage greed does. He looked at the sign on my kitchen floor, then at the stack of documents on the table, and said he hoped I had already poured myself something strong. I told him I preferred tea to whiskey. He nodded and said tea would do. He did not waste time. He asked permission to look through the papers, then read them, the way surgeons study X-rays quietly, thoroughly, without the vanity of commentary. When he reached the bank document with the false authorization, he traced the signature with his finger and said, "My son had not only taken something, but left a fingerprint of arrogance behind." He said there were statutes in this state that addressed exploitation of an elder, and that forgery never sits still for long if you shine light on it from the right angle. He asked if I still had anything with my husband's confirmed signature tax filings, old contracts, the marriage license. I did. He asked if I would be willing to retrieve them, and if he could photograph each item for reference. I agreed. He pulled a form from his case and began drafting letters in a print so clean, it looked like blueprint. One set demanded the bank preserve every record tied to my husband's safe deposit box, entry logs, video footage, signature cards, and the chain of custody for content changes. Another set instructed the title company and recorder's office to place holds against any transfer attempts on my property pending the outcome of a dispute. A third letter warned the real estate agent that any showing without my consent would be considered interference, and that any entry while I was present could be treated as trespass. He marked each letter for certified mail with return receipt, then asked if I would sign them in front of the notary. I did. Hands steadied out. Michael walked my halls like an archivist. He photographed the red sign on the floor, the chalk words on my chest's lid, the folder Daniel had left with sale papers, the empty picture frames where my face should have been. He asked if anyone besides me had keys to the chest. I told him about the old hasp and the key under my pillow. He suggested we record a short video of me opening the chest and panning across the contents so that the condition of the archive was documented. We did exactly that. One take, no drama, just evidence. He did not ask what lay beneath the obvious papers. He did not pry. Respect looks like a young lawyer who understands that not everything has to be known at once to be protected. Said we would not be going to war in the dark. He would build a timeline and attach each document to a date and witness. He would ask a handwriting expert he trusted to compare signatures when the bank released copies. He would call the registrar to verify notices and contact the state's Consumer Protection Division to alert them preemptively. He said the word investigation the way kind people say prayer softly but with belief. But before he left, he asked if anyone had attempted to have me declared unfit to manage my affairs. I told him no doctor had come to the door and no social worker had called. He said he had seen families file petitions without warning, trying to turn a parent into a ward with the stroke of a pen. He said we would watch for that. He also asked if I had a trusted person unrelated to my children who could be named on a temporary power of attorney of my choosing, triggered only by my request. He said it was one way to cut off pretexts. I thought of Harold, who had carried Thomas's warning through the years. I thought of the pastor, who kept his promises in ink. I told Michael I would consider both. We drove to the post office together. He purchased green return receipt cards and fixed them carefully to the envelopes. He dropped them in the slot like seeds. In the car, he outlined the next steps. He would draft a CIN desist letter to Daniel and Karen, instructing them to halt any sale activity, to stop entering my home without invitation, and to maintain all records. He would include a notice that destroying evidence could turn their mistake into a crime they could not outrun. He would copy Evelyn on the letter so her silence could not keep her clean. When we returned, a white SUV blocked my driveway. Karen stood by the trunk, directing two men who carried flattened boxers toward my porch. She had brought movers to start organizing. The boldness of it almost impressed me. Michael stood next to me on the walkway, his expression composed. He asked softly if I wanted him to handle this. I told him I had not come this far to hand my voice to a proxy. I told Karen that no items would be removed, that any inventory done in my house would be done by me, and that today her men would leave. She laughed and said Daniel had authorized the visit, that the house was under the trust, and that I could keep a few things if I wanted them badly. I said the word trespass deliberately. Michael added that a written notice had been prepared and would now be served. He handed her the letter. She read the first lines and her face lost color. The movers looked at one another in the way workers do when they realize the job they were hired for is about to become a headline they don't want. They carried the boxers back to the SUV without another word. Michael advised me to change the locks on the exterior doors. He said to keep the old deadbolts and label them for potential inspection. He would note the date and the reason for the change. He watched as a locksmith he knew installed new hardware. He paid the man and told me he would bill me later for only his out-of-pocket costs. I asked what he charged for his time. He said we could talk about that once I was safe. It was not charity. It was triage. We sat at the dining table as dusk settled, and he asked about Thomas, not about the romance of our marriage, but about the documents. Did Thomas keep a journal, a ledger, notes in the margins of manuals? Anything in his own hand that could speak to intent. I told him about the maintenance notebook from the laundromat, the one Thomas used when he repaired machines after hours, the one that lived in a cardboard box in the attic. Michael said that such notebooks can hold more than wrenches and measurements. Sometimes they hold dates and decisions, and sometimes they carry lines a man writes to himself when he is trying to make sure his wife will not be forgotten. He did not ask for the notebook then and there. He said to bring it down when I was ready, and to open it with the camera running. He left me with a checklist: photograph every room, label fragile items, store the originals of key papers in a sealed envelope at the church safe, with copies at my house and in his office. Keep a log by the door noting every entry and exit. He placed a bound notebook on the table and wrote the first line for Metaday's date, the visit by the agent, the removal of the sign, the service of his letter. He signed his name beneath mine. I saw then how a young man's discipline can become a shield for a woman who thought she had only memories to defend her. That night Daniel called. He did not ask how I was. He demanded to know who I thought I was bringing lawyers into family business. He warned me that consequences would follow. He said he could make things very uncomfortable for an old woman who refused help. He said the word incompetent and let it hang in the air like a trap. I told him that any doctor who knocked on my door would find a woman with her documents in order and her mind sharper than his manners. I ended the call before he could turn his anger into theater. Michael had told me that engaging with threats grants them weight. Silence can be tactical when it's chosen. Around 11, when the house settled into the small sounds that mean it is still alive, I drew down the attic ladder and climbed carefully into the smell of insulation and dust. I found the cardboard box with Thomas's handwriting on the side, shop notes. I carried it down slowly, step by step, as if moving a sleeping child. At the table, I set up the camera Michael had left, pressed record, and opened the box. Inside lay the ledger, its cover stained with oil, its pages thick with diagrams and half-finished calculations. I turned them one by one, pipes sketched in pencil, model numbers, parts ordered, parts saved. In the margins, small domestic reminders: call the electrician, buy more salt, replace porch bulb. Near the back, a note in his firm hand: if anything happens to me, Selma has first and last say over the house. Keep the place hers until the end. It was not a formal instrument. It was a declaration. I photographed the page. I slipped the ledger into a clear sleeve and placed it in the chest. My chalk letters on the lid looked brighter in the lamplight, like fresh stitches on a wound that was learning how to close. I locked the hasp and slid the key under my pillow. Before I turned off the lights, I noticed something I had not allowed myself to notice before. The chest sat low to the floor, but one foot caught the light differently, as if it had been planed against the grain. I knelt and ran my finger along the joinery. Thomas had built that corner with a kind of stubborn care, the nails set deeper, the varnish thicker, the wood warmer to the touch. I tapped the side, gently. The sound was a shade hollower than the rest, like a breath held back. I did not pry. I stood, closed the curtains, and told the room that some doors are worth opening only when you are ready to step through. I slept with the notebook Michael had given me on the nightstand and the index card from the pastor beneath it. The house exhaled around me. Out on the lawn, the hole where the sign had been filled with a thin skin of frost. Tomorrow, the green cards from the post office would start their route. Tomorrow, a young lawyer's letters would arrive on desks where people prefer not to see what they have done. Tomorrow, my son would feel the first tug on a thread he thought he had cut clean. They called my chest empty. They called me the same. Let them keep saying it. I would answer with pages, signatures, stamps, and a woman's name written in chalk across the one thing she refuses to surrender. The summons came on a Thursday morning, folded in a thick envelope stamped with the county court seal. Daniel had filed a petition to replace my will with a corrected version he claimed our family agreed upon. His cover letter, written by some attorney he had on retainer, accused me of confusion and mismanagement, and attached a copy of a document bearing my forged signature. I had read lies before, but never ones that tried to erase me with the very ink that spelled my name. Michael sat across from me at the kitchen table and studied the paper without blinking. He said we would not only contest it, we would bring everything into the open. That night I set the forged will beside Thomas's old ledger. The handwriting in the margins of his notes, from precise, born from years of balancing machines and bills, stood in sharp defiance against the shaky counterfeit Daniel had produced. Michael arranged to have a handwriting expert testify, but he said something else would matter even more: the words in my husband's private journal. the one I had found tucked under the last pile of receipts in the chest. Its first line, written decades ago, had nearly split my chest in two. If you are reading this, Selma, it means our children have failed you. The journal was more than notes. It was my husband's voice echoing across time. In it, he chronicled the long nights at the laundromat, the deals turned down because he didn't trust quick money, the worry that Daniel's hunger for appearances would one day drown his gratitude. Each entry ended with a line directed at my short, careful words like, "I hope you're resting," or "Don't let them wear you down." It was a map of foresight and love. At the back, taped to the cover, was a page I had never seen. "If they betray you, look deeper." The chest has one more secret. 4 hours after Michael left, I turned the chest in circles on the living room rug, running my fingers across every seam. My children had called it empty, but the wood itself hummed with a secret Thomas had built into it. At the rear corner, where the varnish was darker, I found the faint outline of a hidden catch. My nails dug, twisted, and at last a panel shifted with a reluctant sigh. Inside was a narrow compartment holding a folded sheet wrapped in waxed paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. The paper bore Thomas's hand. Property, accounts, and safe deposit reserves belonged to Selma Rowan until her passing. Any claim against her without her consent is invalid. Below his name was the signature of a witness herald. I sat back, staring at the document as if it had grown from the wood itself. The man who had fought beside Thomas had not only remembered a promise, he had sealed it in writing. The chest, my so-called empty chest, had just spoken louder than any lawyer my son could. By the following Sunday, Harold visited. His gait was slower now, cane striking pavement with each step, but his eyes were alive with the same loyalty that had carried my husband through war. When I showed him the compartment and the paper, his lips pressed together, then curved into something between sorrow and relief. He admitted Thomas had asked him to sign all those years ago, as a safeguard against their own children's ambition. He said he had never told me because Thomas swore the moment would only come if the unthinkable happened. "Looks like the unthinkable is here," Harold said, gripping my hand. His touch was warm, firm, reminding me that not all men break their word. We prepared for the hearing. Michael gathered copies, notarized affidavits, the journal, the photographs of the altered family album, the bank records with the forged authorization. He said the court would not only see fraud, but intention and orchestrated campaign to strip me of identity, property, and dignity. He rehearsed questions with me, never treating me as fragile, never softening the weight of what I would say. "You've carried this family longer than they've admitted," he told me. "Now carry the truth." The night before court, Daniel called again. His voice was sugar-coated fury. He said the hearing would humiliate me, that my memory would be questioned, that I'd look like an old woman clinging to scraps of paper no one cared about. He said Evelyn would testify against me. I did not raise my voice. I only said, "Your father built that chest with his own hands. Do you really think he left it empty?" The silence on the line stretched, thin as wire, before he slammed the phone down. Morning came with gray skies. At the courthouse steps, Michael walked beside me, briefcase swinging steady. Harold waited inside, seated near Reverend Cole, who had promised he would speak if the court allowed. Daniel and Karen sat at the opposite table, polished in their business attire, the kind of shine that hides rot beneath. Evelyn avoided my gaze, her hands clenched in her lap. When my turn came, I rose slowly, each step echoing in the room. I held the journal, the photographs, the deed, and the paper Thomas had hidden from me. I told them I was not a woman, confused, not a tenant in my own life, not a burden to be written out. I spoke of the chest, the insults hurled at it, the way emptiness had been forced upon me like a sentence. And then I laid Thomas's words before the judge. The ink he had pressed into paper long before Daniel ever dreamed of law firms or social clubs. The judge studied it in silence. Harold confirmed his signature with unwavering voice. Reverend Cole read aloud the line Thomas had once entrusted him to deliver: "Protect her, because she is stronger than she knows, but no one should fight alone." Daniel's face flushed, his jaw tight with disbelief. Karen whispered sharply into his ear. Evelyn's shoulders sagged, her eyes wet, as if every mile she had put between us now weighed double. The forged will trembled in Daniel's hands. The judge ordered it sealed for handwriting analysis and admitted Thomas's journal and hidden affidavit as evidence. The gavel struck, but it was not the end. It was the crack in the facade my children had built. When we left the courthouse, reporters lingered, sensing a family fracture worth printing. Michael shielded me from questions, but one microphone caught my words when I said, "They called it empty." They were wrong. The sentence was simple, but I felt Thomas standing beside me as I spoke it. That evening, back in my house, I ran my hand along the chest once more. I had thought the hidden panel was the last of its secrets, but Thomas's journal had told me, otherwise, if you are betrayed, go to the final layer. I had not yet found it. Somewhere beneath the wood still lay the heart of his plan. The proof of a life's labor. 11 bars of gold, waiting, not as a weapon, but as the truth that no insult, no erasure, no betrayal could deny. And I knew soon, when the time was right, the whole town would see it. The courthouse was so crowded that morning people stood pressed against the back wall, the air thick with whispers. Some faces were strangers curious about scandal, others were neighbors who once brought pies to my door and now came to watch whether I would be stripped of the little dignity left to me. Michael sat at my side, calm and certain, his files neatly arranged. Across the aisle, Daniel leaned forward, his suit perfectly pressed, his lips curved into the confident smile of a man who believed he had already won. Karen rested her hand on his arm, whispering with eyes sharp as glass. Evelyn sat behind them, pale, her body stiff, avoiding my gaze. The judge entered. The gavel struck. Daniel's attorney rose first, holding up the forged will as if it were sacred. He spoke about confusion, about advanced age, about the need for family intervention. He painted me as a woman grasping at memory, incapable of handling responsibility, a sentimental old widow who confused journals with law. He moved quickly, as if speed alone could bury the cracks in their story. Michael stood, slow but steady. He placed Thomas's journal on the table. He lifted the photographs where my image had been sliced from albums, leaving only edges of my arm, my shadow erased from gatherings I had cooked for, cleaned for, sacrificed for. He brought forward Harold, who confirmed the affidavit Thomas had hidden in the chest, his voice unshaking though his cane trembled slightly. When Reverend Cole spoke, reading Thomas's old message about protecting me, the courtroom shifted. The words fell heavy, as though Thomas himself had returned to give testimony. Then my turn came. I walked with careful steps, carrying the chest itself. Murmurs rippled when people saw it, plain wood, scuffed edges, no one believing it was worth more than kindling. I placed it before the bench. I told them what Daniel had called it empty. I described how my family laughed when I opened it and all they saw were scraps. Then I reached in, lifting the journal, the affidavit, the letters, proof born not of fantasy but of a life carefully built and viciously betrayed. I read aloud Thomas's words. If you are betrayed, look deeper. The chest has one more secret. The courtroom hushed to stillness. Daniel's attorney tried to object, his voice rising, but the judge silenced him. Michael presented the handwriting analysis. The signature on Daniel's will was false. The strokes unnatural, nothing like mine. Evidence mounted like a storm, each piece heavier than the last. Daniel's jaw tightened, his polished mask slipping. Karen's eyes darted across the room, calculating exits. Evelyn lowered her head into her hands. And then it happened. Daniel rose himself, voice cutting through the room. He pointed at me, at his own mother, and said, "She is not blood. She's no mother to me. She's nothing but a tenant squatting in a house she doesn't deserve." The words were knives, loud enough that the reporters scribbled, loud enough that even those standing in the hall could hear. Karen, lips curling, added, "She's just an old tenant we've carried for too long." The courtroom gasped. For a heartbeat it felt like the air itself collapsed. I felt my knees weaken, but I held my ground, fingers pressing the chest for balance. If Thomas's spirit lingered anywhere, it was in that wood beneath my hand. Michael seized the moment. He asked the judge to strike Daniel's claim, not just as false, but as cruelly motivated. He requested Evelyn take the stand. She hesitated, her hands trembling, but the judge compelled her. And there, voice breaking, Evelyn confessed 2 letters she had sent. Daniel proof that she had agreed to cut me out in exchange for promised money. Michael read one aloud. The words hung in the courtroom like smoke. "She's lived her life. We deserve what's left." I closed my eyes, not from weakness, but to hold back the flood pressing at the edges of my chest. Betrayal has a sound. It is your own daughter's voice shaking as she admits she traded you for comfort. People in the crowd gasped. Some even wept quietly. The judge's face grew stern. Daniel reached for the letter, trying to snatch it, but Michael pulled it back, firm as steel. The gavel struck again. The judge announced that proceedings would continue with all evidence entered into record, but he added one line that silenced even Daniel. This court does not take lightly the attempt to erase a parent by fraud. Truth has a way of surfacing. When the session adjourned, the hall erupted in whispers. Daniel stormed out, Karen clutching his arm. Evelyn lingered, tears streaking her face. She tried to approach me, but her voice caught in her throat. Her apology I turned away. Forgiveness was not yet possible. Outside, cameras flashed. I said nothing, only placed my hand on the chest I carried. Reporters shouted questions about wills, fraud, betrayal. I let Michael handle them. For me, silence spoke louder. The words Daniel had hurled in it, not blood, still echoed. They were meant to strip me bare, but instead they revealed him. That night in my home, I sat again with the chest. My hand traced its edges, every groove carved by Thomas's hand. I thought of his journal's last warning. The final layer remains. Find it only when you must. After what Daniel had done in open court, I knew that time was approaching. I pressed along the wood, feeling the faint rattle beneath. 11 bars of gold waited. I was sure now, not as a weapon for greed, but as the undeniable proof that sacrifice, patience, and quiet labor were never truly empty. The trial had not ended. Daniel would come back, angrier, more desperate, but the town had seen his mask crack. They had heard him call his own mother a tenant. And soon, when the last panel of the chest revealed its truth, they would see more than my survival. They would see that everything they dismissed as nothing had, all along, been solid. The courthouse smelled of dust and varnish that morning, the kind of smell that seeps into old wood and never leaves. The air was heavy, the silence sharper than any gavel. Daniel walked in with Karen on his arm, his stride long, his expression carved in stone. Evelyn followed a step behind, her face pale, her eyes red from nights of regret she could not hide anymore. Michael placed the chest on the table before me, the object that had been mocked as worthless, the chest Daniel once called empty. The judge asked for final statements. Daniel's attorney rose, voice steady but thin with desperation. He painted me as manipulative, a widow who spun fantasies to divide her children. He waved the forged will again, as though by repeating it enough, the ink would grow valid. When he sat down, Daniel leaned back with a smile he did not deserve. Michael rose, his voice was firm, the kind that held even the restless quiet of the court. He reminded them of the false signatures, the erased photographs, the letters that Evelyn herself admitted writing. He asked them to look at the chest not as wood but as record. It had preserved Thomas's hand, his warnings, his truth. He asked for one moment of silence, not for me, but for justice owed. Then the judge called on me. I stood, 80 pounds of bones and skin wrapped in 79 years, but steady. I placed my hands on the chest, pressed the latch, and for the first time revealed its hidden compartment. The courtroom leaned forward as the panel shifted and the wood gave way. Inside lay 11 bars of gold, each heavy, each glowing even, under the dim light. Beside them, envelopes of stock certificates, the savings Thomas had guarded in silence, waiting for the day his wife might need to rise. Gasps filled the room. Daniel's chair screeched as he stumbled to his feet, face drained. The judge ordered order in the court, but no voice could silence the sight of what sat in plain view. All the years Daniel called me frail, unworthy, tenant, I had been carrying not just memory, but weight, proof that sacrifice was not empty. I did not keep the chest closed again. I lifted one bar and held it up. It felt heavier than grief, but steadier than anger. I told the room I would not hoard what had been hidden. I announced the bars would be liquidated, the stocks divided, but not to enrich those who betrayed me. The majority would go to the town's scholarships, repairs for the church roof, funding for the small library Thomas and I once brought books to when our children were little. The rest I would keep, only enough to live without leaning on those who had tried to erase me. Daniel shouted that the gold was his by blood, that no court could deny him. The judge's gavel came down harder than thunder. Fraud, perjury, and breach of trust were listed, charges that stripped his words of weight. Evelyn collapsed into sobs, her shoulders shaking as she whispered apologies to no one who could answer them. Karen slipped from Daniel's side, her mask cracked in silence. When the session closed, people followed me outside. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but I simply carried the chest in both arms, not like treasure, but like proof. Reporters begged for a statement. I gave them only one line. They called it empty. It wasn't. Later that night, alone in my living room, the chest sat open. I looked at it without tears. The bars of gold were no longer hidden. The secrets no longer locked away. My house still smelled of old wood and soap. Reminders of the years I spent scrubbing other people's stains while mine were left to fester. But the silence was lighter now. Evelyn came days later, her apology fuller, her face drawn from shame. I listened, but my forgiveness stayed quiet. I told her it may come, but it was not hers to demand. Daniel did not appear. Karen sent no word. The chest remained, no longer a joke, no longer dismissed. The town spoke of me differently, not as a fragile widow, but as a woman who endured betrayal and still stood upright. I did not need their admiration. I needed only to know that when Thomas left me this chest, he trusted I would not crumble, and I hadn't. Now, looking back, I understand something that I never wanted to see before. Families do not break because of distance or disagreements alone. They break because silence allows betrayal to grow. I stayed silent too long. Daniel dismissed me. When Evelyn withdrew, when Karen mocked me with sweet smiles, I believed patience would earn respect. It didn't. Patience, in the hands of the selfish, is just another word for surrender. The chest taught me more than what Thomas hid inside. It showed me that what people dismiss as worthless often carries the deepest weight. They tried to cut me from photographs, from papers, from memory itself. Yet memory kept fighting its way back, pressed into journals, sealed into wood, resting in bars that could not be erased. I learned that if your own children turn their backs, you must still stand for your truth. Because if you don't guard it, no one will dot to those watching who have felt the sting of being forgotten by those you gave everything to. Do not let their rejection define you. You are not empty because they say so. Sometimes dignity has to be carved out of silence, carried like gold no one else can see until the day you show them. I send you this message not as someone broken, but as someone who walked through betrayal and came out with proof that the old are not invisible. Hold on to your own chest, whatever form it takes. Protect it. One day, it may be the only voice that speaks for you. And if you've stayed with me through this story, know that there are more stories waiting, because injustice never stops at one house. Subscribe if you want to walk with me into the next one. Quiet support is louder than you think.